All right, thank you everyone for being here today on this beautiful day, and thanks for being here in person, and those online, and those of you watching this as a recording later on. My name is Kristen Stiltz. I'm faculty director of the Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School, where we are today. We are a vibrant and impactful program with an amazing community of scholars, instructors, visiting fellows, students, and especially our staff members who make everything happen. And we also include an animal law and policy clinic, as many of you know. So I want to thank everyone who made today's events possible, our executive director, Nirva Patel, our program administrator, Kelly Reddy, who's right here, and of course our co-sponsors, the Culture and Animals Foundation. So my privilege here is to introduce Martin, representing the Culture and Animals Foundation, and then I will introduce our speaker and respondent. So Martin Rowe is the executive director of the Culture and Animals Foundation, and prior to that, he was the co-founder of Lantern Books and Lantern Publishing and Media. So Martin, do you want to say a few words before I turn to our speakers today?
Thank you very much. Delicately hold this like this. So thank you very much, and welcome to the 7th annual Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. I want to thank Kristen, Nirva, Kelly, Ella, Sarah Pickering, and of course our speaker, Dinesh, and Laurie for participating in this talk, which came about in rather short notice. You will, if those of us who were here just a few months ago, feels like it was only a few months ago. So it's delightful to be back here at Harvard. So yes, I am the executive director of the Culture and Animals Foundation, which was an organization founded in 1985 by Tom Regan, who literally wrote the book on animal rights called The Case for Animal Rights in 1983, and his wife Nancy, who was very passionately committed to the arts as a way of inspiring imaginations and deepening our understanding in order to promote animal rights. I want to acknowledge also other members of CAF, Mia MacDonald, who is the former co-vice president and now sits on the advisory board. She's over there. Laura Alvea Roja, who is an associate at CAF, who is sitting there. Silvina Petzetta, who is a CAF grantee as well. And for the first time, I don't know if she's here, Yu Wang, who is not here, but she's a 2024 CAF grantee, doing some very interesting virtual reality understandings of bats. So what are our programs? In addition to an annual lecture that is given at universities around the country and indeed the world, we have a fellowship program in which once a year you can research animal advocacy history at North Carolina State University Libraries, which holds the largest collection of animal advocacy material going back 250 years, and we provide a stipend for you to study. And the application period is open now, including to everybody online. Deadline for that is April the 30th. We also hold the Nancy Reagan Arts Prize, which is given to artists who have made a contribution to animal rights, and among our winners are Sue Ko, the political artist, and the photographer Isa Leshko. Excuse me, just go down here. Last time I was here in November, we were just about to announcing, just about to release the audio version of The Case for Animal Rights for those people who couldn't work their way through 450 pages of analytic philosophy. You now have the option to listen to 27 hours of analytic philosophy. But for those who find that a little too much, you'll be glad to know that Empty Cages, which was the book that was published by Tom 20 years ago, this year is shortly to be available as an audio version. And it is, I would say, Tom Regan's Animal Liberation. It's the version that explains why he believes the way he believes and why he acted the way he acted in terms of supporting animal rights as opposed to animal welfare. So all of these programs can be found at our website, cultureandanimals.org, and for those of you in the room, we have brochures and flyers that you can pick up, and urge you to become engaged in an organization that I think has made a good contribution to animal rights. I'll give you one example of somebody whose career was really started by the Culture and Animals Foundation. In 1988, an independent scholar wrote to us asking for a grant to be able to visit a women's studies archive in a university in Texas. And we gave her that money. It was the first piece of money that she'd ever had that allowed her to do that. That woman was Carol J. Adams. The result became The Sexual Politics of Meat, now in its 35th, I think, edition. So those are the kinds of people that we sponsor. Those are the kinds of careers that start. So I will hand it back to Kristen to introduce our speakers today.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So our speaker is Dr. Dinesh Wadiwel, who we're very proud to call our own visiting fellow here at the Animal Law and Policy Program this year. When he's not with us, he's an associate professor in human rights and socio-legal studies in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Sydney. He has a background in social and political theory and is an expert in human-animal studies and disability rights. Prior to joining the University of Sydney, he had a career within social justice, civil society organizations, focused on anti-poverty and disability rights. And just to mention a few of his book publications, The War Against Animals in 2015, Animals in Capital, 2023, and co-editor of Foucault and Animals. So we're very, very pleased to be hearing from him today. And we're grateful that a friend of the Animal Law and Policy Program, Professor Laurie Gruen, came to us today to participate in this. She is a leading scholar in animal studies and feminist philosophy. She works primarily in ethics and social and political philosophy and has more than a dozen books. So I'll just mention some of the highlights: Ethics in Animals, An Introduction, Entangled Empathy, published by Lantern, of course, Animal Crisis, Carceral Logics, co-edited with another program friend, Justin Marceau, and many, many, many others. And so we're very grateful that Laurie came to respond to Dinesh, and it's going to be a very intellectually rich and wonderful hour or so to follow. So thank you both very much.
Could I start by just expressing my thanks to Martin and the Culture and Animals Foundation for this opportunity. It's, of course, an immense honour to give this lecture. I couldn't imagine, if 20 years ago when I started reading Case for Animal Rights seriously, I would never imagine that I'd be able to give this lecture, so I feel very chuffed. Could I also thank Kristen, Nerva, who can't be here, Kelly, Ella, for all the work involved in putting on this lecture, and the Animal Law and Policy Program, which I've been resident within for the last few months, which has been fantastic. One of the best intellectual experiences of my life. And finally, I just want to thank Laurie. Laurie's been a continuing inspiration to me in my career, and it's an immense honour to be sitting next to you and for you to be responding to my speech. So thank you, Laurie. Over the last 5 decades, the global economy has been substantially restructured. Many market economies have walked down a similar and now familiar pathway of structural reorientation. These reforms have included reducing taxation levels, particularly for high-income earners and corporations, shrinking the scope of the welfare state, weakening labour laws and legislating against trade unions, altering the conditions of trade to free the transfer of commodities across borders, and deregulating financial markets. These are some of the transformations that scholars would place under the banner of neoliberalism, a global movement which has fundamentally altered the rationalities that govern economies, politics, and societies. A striking element of these changes is the rapid way in which the winners and losers of market economies have been reorganised. Over this time, as a general rule, the rich have become richer. Arguably, we're seeing this at play globally, with liberal democracies openly manipulated by an emerging class of billionaire rentiers. These shifts have also come at a cost for the living standards and power of many in the world. In many market economies, real wage increases have trailed inflation for many years now, reducing real living standards. Across the world, we see the continuation of low-wage work, increased precarity of the global labour force, and growing numbers of people globally in situations of forced labour. Further, across the world, structural adjustment programs established by international organisations have gone hand in hand with the rise of authoritarian governments, leaving a trail of devastation, including the suppression of popular movements, arbitrary arrest and torture, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearance, all, it would seem, in support of the market. That this radical global social and economic restructuring should occur during a period where human rights norms have gained prominence globally appears somewhat paradoxical. Surely, we could reason, a prominent human rights discourse should have opposed or at least limited the damage posed by neoliberalism. Here we find debate amongst commentators on this very question. Some, such as Naomi Klein, have been highly critical, arguing that human rights have effectively been complicit with the agenda of neoliberalism. Other commentators have suggested that this view attributes too much power to human rights, and that there's nothing intrinsic in human rights to suggest its complicity with unbridled capitalism. Instead, as has been argued by the historian of law, Samuel Moyn, human rights could have developed in any number of different ways, including as a force to oppose or limit capitalism. However, the historical reality is that human rights evolved to become only a weak tool. In response to neoliberalism, human rights, and I quote Moyn, says, it effectively has become a powerless companion. Over the last few years, I've pondered the implication of Moyn's perspective for the modern history of animal rights. Is it an accident that animal rights appear to rise as a discourse during this very period of neoliberalism? Have animal rights had anything to say about global inequality, economic systems, and capitalism? Have animal rights been a force against capitalist exploitation and expansion, or have they simply been a powerless companion? Today, over 80 billion land animals are killed every year for human food consumption. Estimates vary on seafood consumed by humans, but it's perhaps up to 3 trillion fishes per year across wild fish capture and industrial animal aquaculture. More disturbingly than the sheer volume of death inflicted by our food systems is rising global per capita consumption of meat, which has doubled over the last 60 years. This means that it's not simply that animal-based food consumption has increased with human population growth, it is that humans on the planet are eating more and more meat with every passing year. There's also been a 60% increase in global milk production over the last 30 years, with measurable increases in dairy consumption in lower income countries. Certainly, we have seen some success in the expanded availability of plant-based foods. Some might argue that this is a sign of the material impact of animal rights theory. However, rising per capita global consumption in almost every country on Earth suggests that while more plant-based food is being eaten, this isn't necessarily replacing animal-based food. Indeed, what we have evidence of is that all per capita food consumption in general has increased, in line with the history of capitalist food production. This is not necessarily evidence that animal rights or vegan movements have shifted food supplies. Thus, while animal rights frameworks have developed and refined over the last 50 years, animal exploitation has expanded and refined too, almost untouched in a material sense by any persuasion offered by animal rights theory. Here, in my view at least, while animal rights frameworks have provided a powerful account of our ethical responsibilities towards animals, they have very clearly not provided tools for responding to this expanding mass-scale violence against animals. To reframe Samuel Moyn, perhaps we might say that the historical development of animal rights has proved, frustratingly for everyone, or at least everyone here, I suspect, a powerless companion to the explosion of capitalist animal agriculture. Today, in this context, I want to consider animal rights and its vexed relationship with capitalism. Here, I'm not seeking to advance a salacious or absurd claim that animal rights have worked in concert with capitalism to heighten the domination of animals. This is clearly not true. The story, I believe, is much more complex than this. Instead, my goal is to offer thoughts that can help develop the animal rights project as a whole, with the aim of taking in the structural dimension of the violence that billions of animals encounter and articulate more fully the social, political, and economic relations that will be needed to realise animal rights. In my view, Tom Regan's The Case for Animal Rights is a profoundly important text. It is, of course, not a flawless text. No text is. But what I appreciate about the text is its strategic nature. It sets out to develop a rigorous case for recognising animals as rights holders and defends this using the dominant rationalistic arguments that underpin prevailing philosophy and science. Regan's strategy was to construct a defensible rational case for recognition of animal rights, one that would satisfy philosophers and scientists, and one that is, I believe, difficult to argue against because of its consistency. The reason I want to stress the elements of strategy in Regan when considering the case for animal rights is that I want to emphasise that every writer makes decisions about an audience and designs their truth claims to anticipate a readership. But no writer can claim to know what the outcome will be, which forces a level of humility for the writer of any text. Indeed, for those who have read The Case for Animal Rights closely, you'll note several hesitations in the text, where Regan demonstrated his own humility in acknowledging that he did not necessarily have all the answers. This is palpable in the 1981 preface to The Case for Animal Rights, where Regan discusses the limits of the philosophical text he had crafted, and he concedes, and I quote, "Probably no one who has attempted to clear a path through the thickets of difficult ideas has emerged brimming with confidence that every turn was the right one, made for the right reasons," end quote. This is important for emphasising that how we understand animal rights, how they have been framed historically, should of necessity evolve to the circumstances in which we need to use them. In the case of animal rights, Regan famously makes the argument that beings who might be regarded as subjects of a life, whether or not they might be understood as moral agents, have inherent value and are owed respectful treatment. Importantly for Regan, this establishes duties to prevent harm. Regan argues that it is a moral wrong to treat, quote, harmed individuals as merely receptacles of value or as things whose value is reducible to their utility relative to the interests of others, end quote. Here, when examining animal industries, for example, animal agriculture, Regan highlights the contradiction in our prevailing value system. Even if we acknowledge the inherent value that animals have, we face a world where the dominant values that shape animal lives relate to their utility. In animal agriculture, for example, animals simply become raw materials and commodities to be ruthlessly used for profit making. In other words, the market prevails rather than the inherent value of animals. So given this present context, what are the implications of Regan's rights view for the market? Regan provides an answer in the closing pages of The Case for Animal Rights, but it's brief. When considering the economic impacts of demanding rights for animals, he says, and I quote, "The rights view is not antagonistic to business, free enterprise, the market mechanism, and the like," end quote. Regan repeats this proclamation in the epilogue of the text, and I quote, "The rights view is not anti-business, it is simply pro-justice," end quote. Here for Regan, the market is not the enemy. Instead, the animal industry, insofar as animals are used as resources, is the problem. The strategy then proposed, which Regan acknowledges obviously, quote, "obviously requires more than our individual commitment to vegetarianism," end quote, will entail, and I quote, "to help to educate those who support the animal industry to the implications of their support, to help forge the opinion that this industry as we know it violates the rights of farm animals, and to work to bring the force of law, if necessary, to bear on this industry to effect necessary changes," end quote. Regan here expresses the hope that this process of information, persuasion, and legal reform will lead to radical change, amounting to no less than, and I quote, "the total dissolution of the animal industry as we know it," end quote. We could certainly draw the inference that in this vision that Regan presents, animal rights were only intended as a response to animal industries themselves, not capitalism as a social and economic formation. The dream for animal rights presented here by Regan is capitalism without animal exploitation. Again, quote, The rights view is not antagonistic to business, free enterprise, the market mechanism, and the like, end quote. In drawing attention to these perspectives on the relationship between animal rights and capitalism, I'm not necessarily challenging rights as a goal or singling out Regan as necessarily a sole representative of the rights view, since there are other rights views. Rather, I'm interested in what the implications are of a rights view as it has been prominently articulated, which does not deal with capitalism as a problem, and what this means for the strategy of the animal rights movement as a whole. Over the last decade, I've conducted research for my new book, Animals and Capital. I spent a lot of time thinking about capitalism as an economic system and its relation to animals and animal rights. Here, I would like to share some reflections. For Karl Marx, capitalism represented a force or drive to capture value through the production process. This was iconically represented by Marx through the wage relationship. Workers are compelled to labour by capitalism and are only paid a portion of the value they produce. This exploitation drives forward capitalism, which seeks continual profit through production. A prominent formula for capitalism is to overproduce commodities without any reference to need. This means that vast resources are sucked into the economic system to mass produce commodities that may or may not actually be needed by consumers, all with the goal of creating profit by exploiting those who labour. All of this is highly valuable for understanding the environmental predicament we face today. I wouldn't be alone in suggesting that anthropogenic climate change represents the results of an economic system that overproduces commodities for profit beyond the bare needs of human populations. The history of this economic system, which includes European colonial expansion, theft of lands and dispossession, forced labour regimes and racial slavery, unfettered resource extraction, and the construction of nature as a sink for waste disposal, are all processes which have led us to this point where our economic system appears completely antagonistic to life on the planet itself. Marx's perspective also highlights the potential incompatibility of capitalism and the traditional or maybe liberal rights view. As I've discussed, rights assume that the rights bearer has an inherent value, a dignity that must be safeguarded and respected. This would prevent the instrumental use of the rights bearer as a means for another's utility. However, as I've discussed, wage work under capitalism requires the exploitation of the worker for profit, the instrumentalisation of the worker's labour power as a means for someone else's gains. One reason that Marx was sceptical about liberal conceptions of rights was that the processes of production under capitalism have nothing to do with the inherent value of the human worker. For Marx, use values and exchange values reign within market economies, violating all inherent values. Indeed, we live in a world where capitalism routinely violates inherent values as a daily spectacle of humans, non-humans, and living environments. These ideas were highly contentious in the history of rights and remain so. Some liberal rights theorists would suggest both that the wage worker enters contracts freely and thus consents to the exploitation that follows, and further that attempts to intervene in this market were threats to fundamental rights and freedom. Within the history of liberal thought, there's been continuing tension between freedom and equality, with more extreme forms of liberal and libertarian theory potentially tolerating high levels of inequality in order to maintain rights to liberal freedoms. Perhaps this is why Regan, who wrote in the midst of the heat of these debates in US philosophy departments in the late 1970s and early 80s, was so keen to take a strategic approach to reassure readers that the animal rights view was not only not anti-business, but further, and I quote, not anti-freedom of the individual, end quote. However, we have every reason today to ask questions about the compatibility of capitalism with the traditional rights view. Firstly, it is important to note the diversity within liberalism itself. There is a rich tradition of social equality within liberalism, with some liberals suggesting radical steps to deal with the injustices presented by capitalism. For example, few people seem to remember that John Rawls, against today's market orthodoxy, argued for, quote, a property-owning democracy, requiring radical redistribution of property rights to prevent the deterioration of democracy and equality which followed in an unfettered model of capitalism. Secondly, the possessive individualism, which underpins at least some liberal models of rights, is highly incompatible with where we need to go in relation to the problems facing our planet today. It is precisely because of unfettered models of individual liberty and the right to own and dispose of property in unlimited ways that we have arrived in the mess that we're in today. This same individualism is implicated in an economic system that overproduces commodities in order to make profit. Indeed, many environmentalists will highlight that what we need now is to reverse this individualism if we have any hope of mitigating the worst of climate change. Animals are caught up in this hot mess in a number of important ways. As I've argued, capitalism might be described as a mechanism, or maybe organism, which seeks to extract value from production in the name of profit-seeking, and is characterised by a seemingly ceaseless, unending drive for overproduction of commodities. Just like every other commodity, capitalism has leaped on animals and overproduced them through horrific industrialised forced breeding, and within the brutal context of intensive farming, set the lives of animals and their deaths to the marching rhythm of the market. There are two important dimensions here that highlight the interconnection of animal lives and capitalism. Firstly, under capitalism, there is an interconnection between the food system and the ability of the economic system to reproduce its labour force, human life. In order for human workers to go to work, then these workers must be fed using food that can be purchased through wages. During the 20th century, industrialisation of food production radically altered the relative costs of the food supply, increasing the buying power of wages and thus making food more available for most, although not all, people. In other words, capitalism used industrialised production to overproduce food, reducing the cost of this, and through this wider availability, expanded global consumption. Animal-sourced foods are centrally implicated in this story. We see this clearly when we look at chicken production in the 20th century. In 1961, when the UN Food and Agriculture Organization began collecting global records, around 10 billion chickens were killed for food every year. In 2022, it was 75 billion. At the turn of the 20th century, very few people on the planet ate chicken. Today, by volume, this is the most eaten meat worldwide. It isn't the case that suddenly everybody on the planet demanded chicken, explaining as if this is an explanation for this sudden shift in production. On the contrary, we know that what happened to chicken is what happened to any number of commodities over the last 100 years. Cars, televisions, mobile phones, cheap clothing, shoes, cosmetics, bottled water. All these commodities were made cheap, overproduced, and became universally available, disposable, and transformed into an instantly replaceable product that was mass consumed. This is what happened to chickens. As Raj Patel and Jason Moore observe, the cheapening of chicken life is a good example of the way in which capitalism restructured global food supplies, altering the food that appeared on consumers' plates globally, and simultaneously, in driving down food costs, held down wage costs for the system, that is, lowered human labour costs and increased profit. This highlights one structural dimension of the problem we have before us. Very clearly, as the animal rights view will highlight, the inherent value of animals is violated by an industry that turns these beings into mere resources, that is, into use and exchange values. However, the driving force for these rights violations isn't simply a misunderstanding about the moral standing of animals, but a structural problem associated with our economic system and the way in which the means of subsistence has been structured by this system. Human diets have been radically changed, and meat and dairy production have driven this change in diets. But there is a second dimension which I think is important to consider. In my book, Animals and Capital, I make an argument that animals have effectively become a labour force under capitalism. Capitalist food production has captured animal life and turned the metabolic activities of animals to reproduce life and to produce their own bodies into value-creating activities. Again, this gives us a different perspective on the structural problem before us. The growth of animal industries isn't simply about a misunderstanding about the rights of animals or the fact that some humans regard animals as tasty to eat. It is an outcome of capitalism seizing on animals as a labour force and proliferating these lives as a method of extracting profit from their labour. Capitalism does this to human labour, which is also commodified, so we should never have been surprised by this. nor should we be surprised, therefore, that industries remain reluctant to change, even in light of the moral contradiction presented by the inherent value of animals. This helps to explain why today it seems so hard to convince policymakers to wind back animal agriculture, even though it is very clearly contributing to the destruction of planetary systems that enable the reproduction of life on the planet. It also might explain the barriers that might stand in the way of technological change, such as cellular agriculture, since alternatives will need to compete with an industry whose labour force, both human and non-human, whose lives and deaths are bought cheaply. Does all of this mean that I'm arguing that capitalism is solely to blame? Not at all. But I'm highlighting that we are dealing with the collision of different structural forces which have produced the reality that animals live within today. Accordingly, in my book, I argue that if we want to understand the factory farm, we need to understand two different structural forces. The first, which relates to human rights, human relations with animals, and has been the focus of much animal rights theory, is what I would describe as hierarchical anthropocentrism. This is a form of anthropocentrism associated with the European Enlightenment, which imagines humans at the top of the tree and justifies human domination of animals. As a range of scholars such as Claire Jean Kim and Sil Ko have highlighted with their work, this anthropocentrism is also intertwined with other forms of structural inequality, including anti-black and other racism. The second force that produces the factory farm is, of course, capitalism. It is capitalism that leads the drive for overproduction, the implementation of labour-saving technologies or fixed capital that puts the factory in factory farm. We can't understand the factory farm without understanding these two forces, hierarchical anthropocentrism and capitalism, working together. If we want to challenge the factory farm, we need to take on these two very forces. To return to animal rights then, and its relationship to capitalism, it is not that animal rights are essentially a problem or even unhelpful. It is rather that the way that they have been prominently articulated, or perhaps strategically articulated, has proved powerless to deal with the structural forces that are before us. Indeed, as we have seen, insofar as these rights have been carefully and deliberately, maybe strategically, structured to avoid being anti-business or anti-freedom, they have perhaps by design become powerless in the face of the structural forces I've described. To an extent, more recent scholarship, we've started to see the limitations of the animal rights project addressed in some of this more recent scholarship. One important trajectory has been the arrival of the political turn in animal rights theory, perhaps most famously in Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker's important book, Zoopolis, which have asked questions about what sort of institutional arrangements we require to achieve rights for animals. Of course, questions of justice and its application were always a part of earlier animal rights theory, including Regan's The Case for Animal Rights. However, what marks the political turn is the reorientation of focus away from rational argumentation about the need to morally recognise animals towards the problem of how we realise those rights within the context of political and social institutions. A different trajectory has been the growing importance of scholarship, which has interconnected the animal rights movement with other social and political movements, particularly around gender, race and disability. This work has, to some extent, always circled the animal rights tradition. For example, feminist and eco-feminist scholarship, particularly the work of folks such as Carol Adams, Laurie's work, Greta Gard, has drawn attention to the interconnection between the status and treatment of animals, patriarchal social forms, and the relationship of animal industries to gender-based violence and objectification. In this context, I want to draw attention to Alice Crary and Laurie Gruen's important 2022 text, Animal Crisis. The book highlights the importance of early iterations of animal ethics, Peter Singer and Tom Regan, in raising the profile of animals within academic debates and further lifting general public awareness about the status of animals. However, the book also highlights the isolationism of animal ethics historically and its failure to reckon with the relationship between its ideas and the structures of oppression in prevailing societies. Crary and Gruen state, and I quote, "Many violent practices are embedded in larger institutions that not only harm animals but serve to disproportionately burden and often subjugate socially vulnerable groups of human beings. Yet the discipline of animal ethics has, to a significant extent, grown up in isolation from traditions of critical social thought that are dedicated to uncovering the oppressive structures that impact humans and non-humans," end quote. Crary and Gruen's analysis points, amongst other things, to the requirement for interconnected work with a range of social movements and the value of fighting the hierarchical structures that position not only animals, but also many humans in structures of injustice. Here I'm highlighting the need to develop the rights project, both human and non-human. This is a rights tradition that is not merely concerned with the achievement of bare civil rights, the so-called negative non-interference rights associated with some forms of liberalism, but concerned with the broader problem of the social, political and economic institutions that are required to realise freedom, equality and dignity. This is also a critical rights tradition that is self-aware of the historical and constitutive exclusions in the liberal projects, notably in relation to race and racialisation and its interconnection with colonial history. At least in the context of human rights, there is a long history associated with these fuller conceptions of rights. These range from the historic tensions in the development of the core human rights treaties between individual and social and economic and cultural rights, the development of collective and self-determination rights as part of decolonial movements, right up to the current debates which shape the contemporary human rights norms, such as the 2008 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which almost perfectly blends so-called negative and positive rights traditions. All of this has bearing on the wider challenge between animal rights before animal rights today, which in my view, like human rights, cannot afford to detach rights from an analysis of social and economic structures, nor remain agnostic about the sorts of futures we require to realise these rights. Of direct relevance to my talk, in a range of debates today, capitalism is in focus as a justice problem. Rising inequality, whether within states or between states, is of growing concern globally for social movements, particularly as the effects of 40 years of neoliberal restructuring take hold, with demands being made for radical redistribution of wealth and income through tax regimes or through proposals such as universal basic income. Decolonial movements and anti-racist movements have highlighted the structuring role of Indigenous dispossession, extraction, slavery, and regimes of policing and mass incarceration within capitalism, calling for reparations, abolition of carceral policing systems, land back, and new economic systems. Anthropogenic climate change and the reality that, as I've discussed, this is a direct result of our economic system, has led to radical calls for degrowth or no-growth economies, effectively demanding an end to the market fundamentalisms that have given us endless accumulation of wealth as the only perceived pathway to prosperity and well-being. In many respects, capitalist animal agriculture is implicated almost fully in many, if not all, of these problems in some way. Whether we like it or not, animals are also implicated in all radical proposals for futures beyond the present, since every future depends on a food system and imagined relations with domestic and wild animals. The question for the animal rights movement is, to what extent can we afford to be distanced from these broader social and political debates? And more importantly, shouldn't we be part of a conversation about the kind of societies that might enable rights and flourishing, not just for humans, but for life in the broadest sense? Allow me to conclude with a final reflection on Regan, and why it is important to emphasise also that Regan had a vision for a more expansive conception of animal rights as a social justice project. In 1989, Regan participated in a nationally televised debate on animal rights at the Royal Institute of Great Britain. Here Regan put forward a vision for animal rights which, far from being simply about liberating just animals, was instead a cohesive theory of justice and peace, and I quote, "The philosophy of animal rights stands for and not against justice. We are not to violate the rights of the few so that many might benefit. Slavery allows this, child labour allows this, all unjust social institutions allow this. But not the philosophy of animal rights, whose highest principle is that of justice. It is a philosophy that extends the demand for peace beyond the boundaries of our species," end quote. This is not just justice for animals, but the promise of a coherent philosophy that opposes inequality and exploitation and condemns social institutions which provide utilitarian justification for inequality and harm. And we can certainly push Regan further. Surely the philosophy of animal rights, based on a dream of a world where individuals are not used as a means towards others' ends, stands opposed to capitalism as a social and economic institution, which precisely makes use of life as a resource for profit-making, reducing seemingly all inherent values to use and exchange values. At least in my view, the development of animal rights and its success will depend on its ability to articulate such a wider conception of justice, one that offers a vision of a world where rights for humans and non-humans can be fully realised. Thank you.
Unlike most philosophical discussions or theoretical discussions, I'm not going to disagree with Dinesh. My response is really a different articulation of, I think, the same ideas. So I'm not going to be very critical. Part of what is so wonderful about Dinesh's talk today and also his new book is that it is an example of what Alice Crary and I call critical animal theory. And so in my very brief remarks today, I want to introduce or reintroduce some of the ideas of critical animal theory. And just for those of you who are paying attention to certain kind of formations in animal studies and animal theory, critical animal theory is distinct from critical animal studies. Critical animal studies tends to be the view that if you're going to do work, scholarship in the field of animals, it has to be directly about animals and about activism to protect animals. That's what critical animal studies is. Critical animal theory, which is I think what Dinesh is doing and what Alice and I do in Animal Crisis, helps to address the current state of animal exploitation by looking historically at the conceptual and material conditions that allow for, indeed authorize, exploitation of and violence against non-human animals, and so many humans too. It brings critical social thought to bear on the animal problem. So critical animal theory provides a radically different way of thinking about and talking about relations of power in human-animal relations. It helps to bring into focus the social mechanisms that are at play in these relations and challenges hierarchical structures that hurt so many. And capitalism is maybe, I think you were a little like, surely it's not the only problem, but it is a very, very big problem. It's a central problem for causing so many of these harms. Over the last 40 or so years, in arguments with many animal ethicists, including Tom Regan, who he said the last time we met, I enjoyed fighting with all those years. And yeah, I did enjoy fighting with, but I also continue to teach his work all the time, every year, and I value it more and more each year I teach it. I've tried to articulate in my work the conceptual, structural, and material links between the ongoing destruction of animals and the domination of women, other gender minorities, the poor, colonized, racialized, disabled, and other marginalized people. I think of this work as ecofeminist work, of course, but it's that ecofeminism is a broad label, and not all ecofeminists think this way. The basic idea is that these instances of exploitation and subordination can't be taken apart, so that we can't focus only on women, or only on queer people, or only on disabled people, or only on incarcerated people, or only on animals, but that to adequately and effectively right the various wrongs impacting so many others under capitalism, we have to contest them together. Now, of course, not on every moment, not at every instant, but we have to be mindful of the ways in which these the structures of exploitation and oppression are structurally linked to and through capitalism and its other supporting social forces. One of the important insights of this work, I think, is that the social, political, and economic mechanisms that are internal to racial capitalism explain the linked disdain for animals and the subjugation of women and members of other oppressed groups. So critical animal theory is part explanatory work, or more pointedly, I would suggest, what we might call ideology critique. In Animal Crisis, we talk about Carolyn Merchant's early work. She provides an analysis of how, in early modern Europe and its colonies, the advent of capitalist modes of social organization went hand in hand with the use of animals as resources and with the subordination of women, indigenous, and enslaved people. Capitalist expansion coincided with a tendency to exalt production, often erroneously representing it as cut off from social reproduction. And as Dinesh has so vividly illustrated, this Particular fetishization of production, reproduction is also a central feature of animal exploitation. The persistence of capitalism depends on the ongoing treatment of women's domestic labor, animals' metabolic and bodily functioning, as Dinesh has so poignantly put it, and nature itself as freely available resources, what sometimes get analyzed using a Marxist frame as primitive accumulation, is ongoing, never ending. Capitalist societies rely on ongoing expropriation from the earth and animals, as well as on mechanisms for forcibly obliging women to organize their reproductive lives and domestic labor in a manner that supports capitalism's perpetuation and capitalists' profit. And this is super important in the current moment when women's so-called reproductive rights are under such intense threat. The upshot is that women's social subjugation and violence against animals both are products of these interlocking social mechanisms. So Dinesh and some ecofeminists and a few others are forcefully questioning the models of progress and growth that are central to the functioning of racial capitalist societies. By highlighting the violence of capitalism, we can begin to see how the dignity of many humans, as well as animals, is completely obscured from view by capitalist logics of exchange. Tom Regan was one who powerfully argued that respecting animals requires abandoning the notion that they're mere resources. They are, as Dinesh reminded us, subjects of a life. They're also beings with dignity, and recognizing animal dignity, I think, requires challenging capitalist ideology and its instantiation in society. What on earth is that noise? But this is something really important in just the ways that this work to recognize and challenge capitalist ideology and its instantiation is work that is importantly being done by Dinesh. Okay, so can rights be employed in the service of elevating animal dignity and ending their exploitation? Can rights lead us to respecting animals? Here's where I'm still a bit uneasy, even all these decades later. Dinesh imagines, and I'm quoting from what he just recently said, that a rights tradition that is not merely concerned with the achievement of bare civil rights, the so-called negative non-interference rights associated with some forms of liberalism, but concerned with the broader problem of the social, political, and economic institutions that are required to realize freedom, equality, and dignity. This is also a rights tradition that is self-aware of the historical and constitutive exclusions of the liberal projects, notably in relation to race and racialization and its interconnection with the colonial tradition. That's Dinesh's quote. But the idea of rights, whether for humans or non-humans, seems to necessarily uphold a specific conceptual ideology that is part and parcel of the European colonial project. I don't have time because I want us to have time to talk, to get too far into it, but let me just quickly say that I think it's important to be mindful always of the ways that too often the historical or genealogical structure of certain potentially laudable ideals, like rights, carry with them remnants of corrupt power. I can't help but think of Frantz Fanon's reflections in Wretched of the Earth, in which he laments the lingering values of the colonizers that continues to be embraced by those very people who successfully liberated their land and society. He suggested that violent resistance is needed not only to overthrow the alien powers, but also sought as therapy for the disease brought about by colonial subjugation. Getting rid of colonizers is not enough. Dignity can't be reclaimed unless the taint of alien values is also cleansed. As Fanon wrote, quote, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land and from our minds." Part of the decolonizing work that many are currently engaged in, and some advocates, animal advocates as well as some ecofeminists are trying to do this, is to imagine completely new relational grounds for ethical and political engagement for humans and our relationship with one another and for our relationship with other animals. More robust forms of justice, as Dinesh has so poignantly called for, absolutely yes. Through rights, I'm not still convinced.
So we thought we'd let that sit there, right? And maybe open up for questions. I know that we don't have a lot of time. So.
Yeah, so thank you both. Thank you. So I'll answer a couple of questions from the Q&A, and then I'll go around the room. Allison will help out around the room. So the first question is, what are the possible differences between capitalist and communist approaches towards animal consumption and killing?
That's a good question, and it's also a question that's, firstly I should say I didn't mention communism at all in my talk, right? So that's an interesting, almost symptomatic response, right? That when we talk about alternative to capitalism, that immediately people say, are you talking about communism, right? So I would say that if we are talking about communism, we haven't seen it. So I just don't think there is, and so one view of a society after capitalism that I briefly talk about in the book is the idea of a society that is geared towards the flourishing of human and non-human life. To me, that's what I would call socialism, but that's not a socialism we've seen, because the models of socialism we've seen have been effectively state models of socialism that were a combination of authoritarianism and a Promethean attitude of exploitation of the environment. So I don't think we've seen it. And I think it's interesting that this came up, this question, because I didn't mention it, did I? So, yeah.
Thank you. I'll ask one more, and then we'll go around the room. What do you make of John Senbenmatsu's edited intervention, Critical Theory and Animal Liberation?
So I should mention that John is a great inspiration of mine, and he's in the audience. That book remains one of the first serious critical, I would say, I put it in the box that Laurie named of this critical animal theory. It's one of the first examples of these interventions, in that it tries to actually bring this other tradition of critical thinking about society and structural oppression into the conversation about animal rights. The book is underread. Sorry to put you on the spot, John. I recommend reading John's introduction, which to me remains one of the most beautiful texts that we have in animal rights theory that I've read. I think it's an amazing text, so recommend it to anyone.
So then,
Thank you. Hello. So as an Indian vegan, something that I have thought deeply about and was thinking about when you were speaking was the ideas of both casteism and Islamophobia, and how the vegan movement in India has become uncomfortably associated with the idea of pure vegetarianism, which underpins a lot of Brahmin and Hindu supremacy. Do you see this as a symptom of the animal rights movement not being sufficiently in conversation with wider debates about social and economic structures? And are there even ways in which one might resist such harmful conflations without necessarily having the resources to entirely rethink society?
So that's a fantastic question, one that I won't be able to do justice to, but let me just quickly say, I think part of the reason why it's valuable to historicise animal rights as a debate, to provide a genealogy, which I've done a very brief sketch of, is that it reveals, of course, this debate emerged within a particular context, which actually is associated with this country, right? I mean, it emerges from philosophy and political philosophy departments in this country, right? And reflects the concerns and the framing of that country. I'd say that some of the ways that animal rights theory has positioned some of those problems, an example would be the association of meat eating with masculinity, which doesn't actually work in other contexts like India, right? Where actually you have patriarchal Hindu institutions aligning with vegetarianism. So that poses tactical problems. Part of the reason that I think it's important to have a structural historical approach to thinking about this problem is that we need to deal with different contexts and the way that production and framing of production happens in those contexts. And India is a very good example of the limitations of the prevailing frameworks we have. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. That was a great talk. So my question is, given the increasing financial investment in, plant-based startups and things like that, do you think that the idea of ethical capitalism is a contradiction in terms, or is that something that is at all possible?
I would express extreme skepticism. And it's because if we understand what capitalism does, this isn't ethical. So as I said, if capitalism prioritizes use value and exchange value as the driving force of production, and it prioritizes erasing inherent value to do this, right? So we know that within the logic of capitalism, there's no ethics here, right? That's the point. I'd also just say that obviously that I didn't get into this, but there's been a lot of scholarship about I would say the capitalist ends of sort of the vegan animal rights movement, which include the sort of consumer veganism, the faith in technology and particularly cellular agriculture to solve these problems. And what amazes me is the faith placed in capitalism's own production processes to save animals, which we have no evidence that this is the case. In fact, we have evidence of the opposite, that at every turn, capitalism will seek to expand and exploit even more lives to make more money. So I would take that strong view that there's no place, that ethics and capitalism don't go together, but others may want to argue with me on this. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. My question is as follows. I guess, and feel free to correct me here, but what I'm understanding is that your fundamental critique of capitalism is that capitalism pathologically extracts value. I guess my skepticism stems from the fact that I think if you look at a set of values of any society, and then you look at that society's fundamental economic institutions, it's going to be all too easy to draw connections between that society's values and that society's economic institutions. But historically, there have been a bunch of societies that are not really capitalist and yet have these sort of exploitative values. I mean, slavery originated in non-capitalist societies. My parents grew up in the Soviet Union, and I agree with you, that's not the type of socialism you aspire to, but nevertheless, that's not a capitalist structure that seeks to sort of exploit value from everything. And actually, the way they treated animals was worse than here in terms of attitudinally, not maybe in practice, but like it was not uncommon to see like cats and dogs strung up on fences. So I guess what I'm sort of diagnosing here is like it's all too easy to draw these connections between fundamental economic institutions and values. But if you look historically, it feels like the values we're trying to critique don't really correlate with those economic institutions. So why are we trying to draw these sort of colorful connections?
That's great, yeah. So, and again, to emphasize, and something I mentioned in the talk, what we're dealing with is the combination of two different structures or forces, like two different value systems. One is an anthropocentrism, which pervades many human societies, and historically it's pervaded many human societies. It takes on a peculiar form, I'd say, with the Enlightenment. I'm not alone in making this point, that something happens with the European Enlightenment that produces this rationalistic order of beings and places humans at the top of the heap, and also allows for a seemingly unlimited exploitation of beings underneath, right? That force collides with the capitalist economic system, and the two things come together to produce the reality we have. I'd agree with Laurie that there's more stuff going on there. Like, there's different forms of structures of oppression, but the book makes the claim that if we really want to understand the factory farm, we're understanding these two things coming together, right? I've drawn this actually from this approach from another thinker, which is Cedric Robinson. So Laurie mentioned the idea of racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson in Black Marxism makes the point that probably forms of racism preceded capitalism in feudal societies, but then capitalism as an economic force comes along and transforms that racism, including through forms of dispossession and colonialism, through racial slavery, which is distinct in form in that period of capitalism, and produces the contemporary experience of the global redistribution of wealth and resources, right? So just in line with what you're saying, I think I'm agreeing with you, right? That actually you can't reduce a society just to the values in the economic system. But what we're seeing is a combination of these two things coming together. The question for me strategically, as an animal rights person or an animal rights as an animal advocate, is how do we untangle this, right? And can we just simply focus on rights for animals, or do we need to be looking at the structural problem as well? I also make this observation at a time when lots of other social movements are asking questions about capitalism itself and its incompatibility with life on the planet. So I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you, Dinesh and Lori. This was really great. One question I had while I was listening to you was sort of where climate change fits into this. In particular, I'm wondering if you can sort of thread the needle in terms of promoting capitalism and promoting animal rights if you look at climate change, in that animal agriculture is probably one of the leading causes of climate change. And I think, I haven't studied this, that climate change is one of the biggest threats to capitalism and one of the biggest threats to businesses thriving. If we're not here anymore, we can't promote capitalism. So I'm wondering if you had a room of folks that had very differing views on probably most of the people here that really don't care about animal rights, if that's a strategy in terms of, if we work on better treating animals, if we work on eliminating factory farming, we will reduce climate change, which in turn will actually help capitalism. And I'm just wondering if you have any views with that sort of framing or thinking.
I don't have concrete views, but you raise an important point, right? So for us as advocates, we have a number of goals that we're seeking, and there are some tactics we can choose to achieve those. One might be, well, let's all get onto a kind of climate change wagon, which is about going to businesses, going to capital and saying, hey, if we just eliminate this animal agriculture, we're going to solve this problem that we know is coming for you. I guess the point I'd make is that, in my view, animal advocacy, the animal rights movement, has a broader justice remit, right? That goes beyond just saying we're just interested in animals, right? And I guess part of my talk is to say, actually, I think we are part of, right from the start, one thing I'd say about the animal rights movement is that we've been we haven't lied about the fact that we want to radically restructure societies. We haven't lied about this. We want to actually stop a form of domination that has haunted many human societies. We want to actually stop that. And I think there's something really interesting about that. And to me, one question I'd ask is, well, why would we stop there, just thinking about animals? Why wouldn't we think about producing a more just world, right? So again, I'm not meaning to say that there aren't tactical opportunities for us to work within the bounds of capitalism. But given how radical our project is, shouldn't we be engaging with other social movements to realise what I think is actually the promise of a world that is about flourishing beyond the human? I hope that makes sense.
Thank you to both our speakers. I'm sorry that we're going to have to stop there. There's a class in here at 1:30. So thank you both very much, and thank everyone for coming.